Feeler gauges are a precision metal strip that is designed to fit between two components to measure the gaps. Feeler gauges can come in lots of different sizes. They can be a round pin size like this style, or this style, which is a bent feeler gauge. Now these are a tool steel, so if you actually just bought a feeler gauge and you wanted to make it a bent feeler gauge, the problem with doing that, if you take, say, a straight one, is you are going to have issues with cracking and breaking. So these ones are built this way. They are designed to be bent, and this allows you to slide underneath something while keeping the feeler gauge out of the way. Feeler gauges can also be large. You can see this is a large feeler gauge. It still has the same job where it's going to slide between two components and measure the amount of space between those. We also have some specialized feeler gauges. This one is a spark plug feeler gauge. So the way that this one is going to work is we are going to take our spark plug and we are going to slide it in on the narrow end and rotate it around until it stops moving. And then we would measure off either in thousandths or in metric on the other side what our gap on the spark plug is. When we use a feeler gauge to take measurements of clearances or gaps, it takes some practice to be able to feel what the gap actually is. One of the most common things that guys will have when they start out using a feeler gauge is they will tend to be too tight. So if we take our micrometer, this is another good way to be able to learn how to use a feeler gauge. Because with our micrometer we can set a known distance and then we can actually measure that distance and know what we are actually measuring. So for example, I am just going to zero this one right now, and I am going to set it at 0.1 of a millimeter, 0.101, and I'm going to lock it. And this tool here is a specialized feeler gauge. It's designed for use on the 911 engines. You can see how it's bent. This is so you can get down underneath the rockers to adjust the rockers. The clearance on the 911 rocker is 0.1 of a millimeter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to feed it in to my gap into my clearance so I can slide it and feel it. And what it does, when you have a preset size where you can feel what the clearance is, you can move the gauge around underneath and feel what it's supposed to feel like and how much pressure. Now, if this was too tight, and I could easily do that if I unlock it and I tighten it up, I can still move my feeler gauge, but it's a lot tougher. And it's also a lot harder to get it started as well. So I will tend to want to pop out and then I won't be able to feed it back in. If I set the micrometer to a much larger setting, it's going to feel a lot looser, even though you can still feel a drag on it. So one of the good ways to practice using these tools is to practice on a known dimension. Feeler gauges also come in some other specialized type of feeler gauges. These ones have a step on them. So this part of the feeler gauge out here is a different size than this part of the feeler gauge. And it's engraved on the gauge, so this one is 24 thousandths on the thin, or 0.610 millimeters, and then 26 thousandths back here past this ground section. What this does is it allows you to slide the feeler gauge between the clearance items, and you can measure if it is within the range. So if it slides in easy and then hits the larger step on the feeler gauge and won't go in, then the size is going to be right in between the two sizes, which would be 25 thousandths or approximately 0.630 millimeters. If it slides in tight on the front, you know it's going to be tighter than that gauge, or if it slides all the way through, you know that the clearance is larger than the largest part on the gauge. So this is a specialized type of feeler gauge that you can buy. It's especially handy when you are checking valve clearances. It'll give you a good range, and it's good when you're learning too, because you can set a clearance right here on the low side and then press it forward and see if you are tight or if you are loose. If you're too tight, what will happen is it'll bump up and it'll take a lot of pressure to push that. If you're too loose, then it will bump up against the higher tolerance and slide over. Another specialized feeler gauge is a brass feeler gauge. Now these are used when we're using or measuring something that's magnetic. So for example, if I wanted to check this ignition distributor, the ignition distributor clearances right here on the impulse generator are magnetic. So if we take our steel one, it will actually stick to these surfaces, and that will affect how we measure. So if I was trying to measure the clearance between these and I slide my feeler gauge in, it's hard to get a good feel for what's happening because the magnet is sucking the steel gauge to it. So in this instance, we would use a brass gauge, and a brass gauge is going to work exactly the same way. It's going to allow us to feel the different gaps without being influenced by the magnetic properties of this particular device. Another section on a distributor where we would use a feeler gauge would be if we are setting the end float. So the end float is the shaft, amount of movement back and forth that the shaft is allowed to have. And the way that we would check this is we would take our feeler gauges. I'm just going to use a straight feeler gauge on this one. And we are going to measure off what gauge will actually fit in between the gear and the thrust washer. So on this particular one, the first gauge that I used, which was a .178, oh, actually the 178 does fit. Okay. So the .203 is too tight. The .178 will slide in and feels nice and smooth. I can feel a light drag on the feeler gauge. And then if I want to check it even further, if I go down to my next size is really loose, and we can see that the gauge can flop and can move around. So what I'm doing is I'm using the gauge to measure out, and you can see that I had a little bit of trouble at first. You've got to make sure that whatever you're measuring is in its neutral position, in which case I didn't have it pushed all the way out to measure it. Pin gauges are still a feeler gauge. The only difference is they are round. So on this particular tool, and this is a universal mandrel, and we've got our pin gauge set, which is just the same as a set of feeler gauges, where these are all different size pins. And what we're going to measure with pins is a round hole. So for this, I'm going to use cylinder head. The way I've got it set up right now, this is a 912 or a 356 cylinder head, and our valve guides have a clearance down here of 10 millimeters is the nominal size, and a wear limit of 10.15 millimeters. So what I've done is I've installed a 10 millimeter pin gauge on this end and a 10.15 millimeter pin gauge on this end. And what it's going to allow me to do is install the pin gauge, and it should slide into the hole nicely. Now, when a pin gauge is right on its correct size, it can be a little bit difficult to slide it in. So you need to be able to not discount early if you have a size. If you put a 10 millimeter ream through here, and you know it's 10 millimeters, the 10 millimeter pin gauge will slide in. Now, what I do with the other side to see if the valve guide is serviceable, I can flick it around and I can see that our wear limit will not go into the hole. Now on this one, if I check our exhaust guide, we can see our 10 millimeter gauge slides in and we've got a lot of slop. Our 10.15 also slides in. So that means that this valve guide is worn out and needs to be replaced. This valve guide is still serviceable and within the wear limits. Feeler gauges have a lot of uses throughout the entire vehicle, and it takes practice to be able to get a good feel for what the gauge is doing. One of the hardest ones to measure are a set of ignition points, because the ignition points are spring-loaded. So this one is one where you would set the points maybe using a dwell meter on the car or on a distributor machine, and then take your feeler gauge for the size that they should be and slide them in. Now, it's also important when you're setting a set of points that the points are also on the distributor cam in the right place, so they're being held open. But it's something that will take practice and doesn't come immediately. Depending on each individual and how well you respond to feedback is how well you will be able to use feeler gauges.